In this lecture, we're going to learn about logical operators. These operators will work on Boolean operands. We're going to look at AND first to really make sense of how they work. Here is a simple table we can use to try out the AND operation. It is going to be working on two operands, A and B. And in the third column here, we're going to have the result. So if A is false and B is false, and we do A and B, the result is going to be false. If A is false and B is true, the result is going to be false. If A is true and B is false, the result is going to be false. If A is true and B is true, the result is going to be true. The way you can think about this AND operator is that if any of the operands is false, the result is going to be false. And if you really use this way of understanding this, it is going to be really easy. In the first line here, we have a false, so the result is going to be false. In the second line, we have a false, it's going to be false. In the third line, we have a false, the result is going to be false. But in the line number 4 here, we don't have a false. A is true and B is true, so the result is going to be true. Another operator we have is OR, and it is going to evaluate to true if any of the operands is true. Let's look at the first line here. A is false and B is false, so we don't have a true. The result is going to be false. On the second line, we have a true. The result is going to be true. On the third line, we have a true. The result is going to be true. On line number 4, we have a true. The result is going to be true. And you don't really have to memorize these tables. If you use these operators long enough, these things are going to be drilled in your memory. If you have any problem with these operators, just look up tables like this and you can find whatever it is you need without really memorizing these things. Another operator is the NOT operator, which is going to negate whatever you gave it. So if A is true and we negate that, we're going to get a false. If A is false and we negate that, we're going to get a true. And we use this exclamation mark to say that we are negating something. If you go back to OR, it is denoted by these two vertical bars, and the AND operator is denoted by these two ampersand symbols here. Okay, now that we know about these logical tables for these logical operators, we can actually try to use them in code. Here we have 3 Boolean variables. We have A, B, C. A is true, B is false, C is true. We can print them out and you see that we are setting up stdc out to give us the results in the format of true and false instead of ones and zeros. And down here you see that we are trying to use the AND logical operator. Down here you have A and B, A and C, and we are doing this on 3 operators and chaining these things up. So we are saying A and B and C. And let's try and do this in our mind to see that we really understand this. We have seen that the AND operator evaluates to true when all operands are true. Another way to say this is the AND operator evaluates to false if any of the operands is false. So we're going to AND A and B. A is true, B is false, so the result is going to be false because we have a false in here. A and C is going to evaluate to true because A and C are true. A and B and C is going to evaluate to false because we have a false in here. Even if you have 1,000 trues and you AND that with 1 false, that's going to be dragged down to evaluate to false. That's what we are seeing here. We can also do OR operations on these things, and this is going to give you a true if any of the operands is true. We know that A is true and B is false, so this is going to evaluate to true. A and C is also going to evaluate to true because A is true. A and B and C is going to evaluate to true because A is true. So let's go back and see this. These are the values we're going to be using here. We can also try out the NOT operator, and it is going to negate whatever we gave it. So if A is true, we're going to get a false. B is false, we're going to get a true. C is true, we're going to get a false. Another thing you can do is combine these logical operators. So we can do something like A and B and OR that with a C. And you should notice that we are wrapping our expressions here in parentheses so that we don't have the same problem we experienced and explained in the last lecture. And one thing you should know is that for the compiler to evaluate these things, we are going to follow the rules in our table for precedence and associativity. But we used parentheses to really make this easy to follow. So we are going to AND A and B, and the result of that is going to be ORed with C. And you can try and do this in your mind, and you're going to figure this out. But we're also going to go to Visual Studio Code in a minute, and we're going to see all these things in action. The last thing you can do is combine logical and relational operators into expressions. For example, here we have D, E, and F. They are integers, and we can print them out like we are doing here. But we can do something like D greater than E, and we're going to AND the result of that with D greater than F. And we know that these relational operators evaluate to Booleans. So we can use these Booleans with logical operators like we have been doing all along in this lecture. So for example, let's evaluate the first one here in mind so that you really see what this is all about. D is 45, E is 20, so D greater than E is going to evaluate to true. D greater than F, that's also going to evaluate to true. So true and true, that's going to evaluate to true, and this should print a true on the terminal. We are going to go to Visual Studio Code and actually play with these things. Okay, here we are in our working directory. We're going to jump into our template project and copy the files we need. And we're going to put them in our lecture on logical operators. We're going to put that in here. We're going to open up this folder in Visual Studio Code, and it is going to show up here in Visual Studio Code. We're going to get rid of what we don't need, and we are going to put in the code to play with these things. We have three Boolean variables. A is true, B is false, C is true, and we can print them out, and we're going to see their values. And you see the setup here so that stdcout is going to show things in the format of true and false. And down here, we are ANDing a few values. We are using the AND operator, and it is denoted by these two ampersand signs. So A is true and B is false and C is true. A and B is going to evaluate to false because we have a false in here. And again, if this doesn't make sense, please do consult the tables for all these logical operators, and all these things are going to make sense. This is going to evaluate to false because we have a false in here. And A and C, we have true and true, so this is going to evaluate to true. And A and B and C, this is going to evaluate to false because we have a false in here. Remember, as soon as you have a false in your AND logical operation, you're going to get a false in your result. So we're going to have a false here. We can try and compile this and see if this is actually what we expect. We're going to bring up a terminal we're going to use here, and we're going to run the tests to build with GCC. And if we run our Rooster program, we're going to see that A and B is false. This is what we expect. A and C is true. This is what we expect. A and B and C is false, and this is what we expect. This is how you can really play with your AND logical operator. If you want, you can change things up to really try and see if they live up to your expectations. Now we have changed A to false. Let's try and build again. We build with GCC, and we're going to run our program. And we're going to get A and B is false because they are all false. A and B are false. So false and false evaluates to false. A and C is false because A is false. So we're going to get a false as the result. A and B and C is also going to evaluate to false. Okay, we have these things in here. Let's bring this back to what it was before. So A is going to be true, B is going to be false, C is going to be true. And we're going to try and play with the OR operator. We are going to go down and put in code to actually play with this. And it is really nothing special. We are just using the OR operator here, which is denoted by these two vertical symbols. And OR is going to evaluate to true when at least one of the operands is true. Okay, so we have our values here. A is true, B is false, C is true. A or B is going to evaluate to true because A is true. A or C is going to evaluate to true because A is true. A or B or C is going to evaluate to true because one of these things is true and A is true here. We can try and run this. We're going to build this first with GCC. And if we run this, we're going to go down here and run Rooster again. And you're going to see that all these things are true here because one of these things is true. And as long as you have one true operand, your OR operation is going to evaluate to true. And again, this is following the precedence and associativity rules we have. If we go back to our table in our browser, we're going to try and look at logical OR. It is left associative, so we're going to try and evaluate this from left to right. So we're going to OR A and B, and the result of this is going to be ORed with C. We have also seen the NOT operator, which is denoted by the exclamation mark here. And what it is going to do is basically flip off or negate whatever it is you have. If you have a true in your variable, the result is going to be false. If you have in a false, the result is going to be true. And not A is going to be false because A is true. Not B is going to be true because B is false. And not C is going to be false because C is true, as we can see here. So let's run the application and see if this is what we expect. We're going to run and build with GCC, and we're going to run Rooster, and we're going to see that not A is false, not B is true, and not C is false, and this is what we expect. We have also seen that we can do combinations of these operators. So for example, we can look at the expression we have here. We're going to take A and B. This is going to evaluate to false because B is false. We're going to negate this and we're going to get it true, and we're going to OR that with C, but because it's true, we know that the result of ORing this with anything is going to be true, so we expect this expression here to evaluate to true. If we run this, we're going to see that this is going to evaluate to true, and it is what we expect. The last thing we want to see in this lecture is that we can combine these logical operators with the relational operators we have seen in the last lecture. We are going to put in a piece of code to play with this. This is lengthy, but you can play with this and see what this is going to evaluate to. To start you off, we are going to do the first one together. So it does test if D is greater than E. And if you look here, 45 is greater than 20. So this is going to evaluate to true. And we're going to end that with D greater than F. The result of this is going to be true. So we're going to be ending a true and a true. And the result of this is going to be a true. And again, notice that we are wrapping this in parentheses to avoid problems with the compiler being confused with what we are trying to print. This is going to get rid of the otherwise ugly problems we might have to deal with if we didn't wrap this into parentheses like this. So we expect to see a true here, and we're going to build and run the task to build with GCC, and we're going to run Rooster. And if we look at the first thing here, this is going to be true, and you can try and do the other ones in your mind as an exercise. And if you have a problem, don't hesitate to ask me. I am going to do the best I can to help you out. This is really all we set out to do in this lecture. I hope you have a better understanding of these logical operators. Again, you don't have to really memorize them. All you have to do is consult the tables and you're going to basically know the result of your two operands depending on the values you have inside for AND, OR, and the NOT operator. We are going to stop here in this lecture. In the next one, we're going to see how we can format our output to make it really look better. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.